Along the quiet coastline near Vladivostok, the sea looks calm and peaceful, but beneath the surface lies a haunting reminder of the Cold War. Hidden in the murky depths are the remains of old Soviet submarines, massive steel giants that once symbolized power and fear but are now left to rust away in silence. Locals call it the Submarine Cemetery, a place where forgotten vessels sleep under the waves, their presence both mysterious and dangerous. For years, the existence of this underwater graveyard was kept secret, only mentioned briefly by journalists like David Muir and Elizabeth Vargas, who hinted that something far more serious was hiding beneath the surface. As new evidence has come to light, experts have discovered that this is not just a collection of old submarines, but a decaying legacy of nuclear technology that still poses serious risks to the environment and human life. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union built one of the largest and most powerful submarine fleets in the world. These submarines were meant to maintain a nuclear balance with the West and demonstrate the Soviet Union's ability to strike anywhere on the planet. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Navy had hundreds of submarines ranging from attack submarines to massive ballistic missile carriers like the Typhoon class. Some of these submarines were over 570 feet long and capable of carrying 20 nuclear missiles each. They were technological marvels for their time, built quickly in shipyards across the Soviet Union, from the icy waters of the Kola Peninsula to the far eastern ports of Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. But the rapid production and operation of so many submarines created a new problem: what to do with them once they were no longer usable. The Soviet Navy's constant need for training, patrols, and maintenance put a heavy strain on resources, and when submarines reached the end of their service life, there was no clear plan for safe disposal. In Vladivostok, this problem became impossible to ignore. The port city was one of the main bases for the Soviet Pacific Fleet, and as older submarines were retired, they began to pile up in the surrounding bays. Stripped of their equipment and left to rot in shallow water, they formed a grim sight: rows of corroding steel hulls, some half-submerged, others barely floating. Over time, locals began referring to it as the Submarine Cemetery. Many of these submarines still contained nuclear reactors, some with traces of fuel inside. Decommissioning a nuclear submarine is not easy. The process involves removing nuclear fuel, handling radioactive materials, and cutting apart the submarine's hull, all while ensuring no contamination leaks into the environment. During the Soviet era, there were systems designed for this, but they couldn't keep up with the enormous number of submarines being retired. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia inherited this massive naval burden but lacked the money and infrastructure to deal with it properly. Experts who have studied the Vladivostok Submarine Cemetery describe it as a tragic monument to the Cold War, a place where dozens of nuclear-powered submarines lie abandoned, rusting away, and slowly releasing toxins into the sea. The problem was not just decay but danger. Many of these submarines were never fully dismantled. Some were left with their reactor compartments intact, which meant that even decades later, there was a real risk of radiation leakage. In some areas, the submarines are packed so closely together that they almost touch, their once sleek hulls now eaten away by saltwater and time. Former naval engineers have said that these sites were meant to be temporary storage, but without funds or planning, they were simply forgotten. The dangers of neglecting nuclear submarines became painfully clear in August 1985, when disaster struck at Chazma Bay near Vladivostok. What began as a routine refueling operation turned into one of the worst nuclear accidents in Soviet naval history. The crew was refueling a nuclear submarine when a sudden and uncontrolled chain reaction occurred inside the reactor. Within seconds, a powerful thermal explosion blew the reactor's heavy lid high into the air, sending a massive cloud of radioactive steam and debris across the shipyard. 10 people were killed instantly, and dozens more were severely injured. The explosion scattered radioactive materials across the dockyard, the submarine's decks, and the surrounding area. The fire that followed burned for hours, spreading even more contamination. Chazma Bay, once a quiet and unremarkable inlet, became a scene of horror. The Soviet authorities immediately sealed off the area. Security forces surrounded the site, evacuated nearby facilities, and kept the incident secret from the public. The families of those who died were told almost nothing about what had really happened. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the truth began to emerge. Radiation tests later showed that the soil, water, and seabed around Chasma Bay were contaminated with dangerous levels of cesium and strontium. Even decades later, scientists can still detect traces of radioactive material in the bay's sediments and marine life. This accident revealed just how dangerous it was to work with nuclear submarines under pressure and without proper safety measures. It showed that a single mistake during maintenance could cause a catastrophe with long-lasting effects. For the Soviet Navy, it was a lesson written in tragedy. The Chasma Bay explosion not only took lives but also poisoned the land and sea for generations. Even today, experts point to that event as a warning about the risks of leaving decommissioned nuclear submarines in shallow water. A single slip-up, a corroded reactor, or a forgotten fuel rod could cause another disaster. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Russia was left with the enormous challenge of dealing with hundreds of old nuclear submarines. Many were already decommissioned or waiting to be dismantled, but there was little money to handle them safely. In the early 1990s, more than 180 nuclear submarines needed to be defueled and taken apart. Each one contained a reactor, some still holding spent nuclear fuel, and the facilities required to process them were limited. Cutting up even one submarine could take over a year, and Russia had hundreds waiting. Defueling these submarines was a dangerous and expensive task. It required removing the radioactive fuel rods, sealing them in secure containers, and moving them to special storage sites. But in many cases, this never happened. Some submarines were left floating at docks with their reactors still full, posing enormous risks to anyone nearby. Others were partially dismantled, cut open, stripped for parts, and then forgotten, their reactors left untouched because there was no equipment or money to finish the job. Throughout the 1990s, Russia's economic crisis made things worse. Many shipyards couldn't afford to continue decommissioning work, and in some places, submarines were simply left to decay. Environmental groups like Greenpeace and the Bellona Foundation started to sound the alarm, releasing reports and photographs of rusting submarines left in harbors and bays. These images showed the haunting sight of decaying conning towers and corroded steel skeletons poking out of the water, symbols of a forgotten fleet that had once carried nuclear weapons across the oceans. As international concern grew, several countries stepped in to help. The United States, Japan, Norway, and others joined Russia in cooperative programs to reduce the nuclear threat. Through initiatives like the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, they provided funding, equipment, and expertise to speed up the dismantling process. These efforts helped defuel and dismantle dozens of submarines, cutting down the most immediate dangers. Massive steel reactor compartments were removed and placed in special long-term storage facilities designed to contain residual radiation. Even with this help, progress was slow. Dismantling a nuclear submarine is an incredibly complex process, requiring heavy cranes, dry docks, and radiation-shielded facilities. Transporting the reactor compartments from remote coastal bases like Vladivostok to central storage areas was another challenge, especially given Russia's vast geography. Some submarines remained in place for years, waiting for resources to become available. By the early 2000s, Russia had made significant progress, but many submarines still hadn't been fully defueled or safely stored. Some reactor compartments contained leftover radioactive materials, which meant they could still pose risks if corrosion breached their protective layers. Environmental groups continued to warn about the danger of these forgotten submarines, pointing out that while short-term safety had improved, long-term monitoring and containment were still lacking. The rusting submarine hulks near Vladivostok tell a story that combines pride, neglect, and danger. They are reminders of the Cold War's technological race, when nations built vast arsenals of nuclear weapons and machines without thinking much about their eventual disposal. For the people living near these coastlines, the threat is not abstract. Contamination from old reactors and radioactive materials can enter the food chain, affect local fishing industries, and harm marine life. Scientists monitoring the area have found traces of contamination in seawater and sediments, indicating that time is slowly working against these submerged relics. Saltwater corrosion continues to eat away at their hulls, and with each passing year, the risk of leaks grows. Yet, removing them safely remains a monumental task requiring billions of dollars, advanced technology, and political will. The submarine cemetery near Vladivostok stands as one of the world's most chilling reminders of how power and secrecy can leave behind a legacy of danger. Beneath the calm waters, the ghosts of the Cold War still rest silent, decaying, and slowly releasing their toxic memories into the sea. The world may have moved on from the rivalry that created them, but the consequences of that era continue to rust quietly in the dark, waiting for someone to finally bring them to peace. The process of dismantling Russia's decommissioned nuclear submarines has always been slow, complicated, and uncertain. Insiders have often pointed out that the schedules were constantly revised or postponed, and the projects were frequently underfunded. Each delay created fear and anxiety among people living near the storage sites, who were never sure whether the submarines decaying nearby could someday pose a danger to their health and environment. Even today, the traces of this massive backlog can still be seen across Russia's far eastern coast. At some designated storage yards, rows of old submarine reactor compartments lie stacked side by side. These compartments were cut away from retired vessels but never fully neutralized. Some old submarines are still floating, waiting for dismantlement that may never come. And in several cases, officials don't even seem to know exactly what has happened to certain submarines, whether they were defueled, cut apart, or simply left anchored and forgotten. For the experts studying this issue, the lesson is painfully clear. Building a large nuclear fleet is far easier than safely taking it apart. Every single reactor, every hull, every piece of radioactive material requires years of effort and millions of dollars to deal with properly. Although international cooperation helped reduce some of the most dangerous risks, the overall story is still one of incomplete cleanup, unfinished work, and long-term uncertainty. The political side of this problem is just as important as the technical one. Russia has relied heavily on international funding and technical help to manage parts of its aging nuclear fleet. This dependence raised many concerns about transparency and accountability, as some organizations reported that certain sites were still off-limits for inspection and that not all progress had been properly documented. For many years, rumors spread quietly around Vladivostok about the submarine cemetery just off its coast. Locals had seen the rusting hulks but never truly knew the scale of what lay below the surface. It wasn't until detailed surveys and published investigations pulled back the curtain that the real picture emerged, and it was worse than anyone imagined. Experts discovered dozens of decaying submarine hulls clustered together in shallow bays and nearshore slips. Some were loosely tied to piers, others half-submerged or completely flooded. All bore the marks of time, rust, broken structures, and damage caused by years in saltwater. The locals' nickname turned out to be accurate. It was indeed a graveyard of submarines. But the most alarming discovery came later. Many of these abandoned submarines still contained their reactor compartments, and in some cases, even spent nuclear fuel assemblies remained inside. For decades, officials had claimed that all these submarines were defueled before being abandoned. The surveys revealed this was not true. Some of the reactors were still radioactive, and corrosion was spreading fast. As one naval engineer described it, the site was not just an old scrapyard, it was a living hazard where rusting steel, leaking radioactive material, and incomplete dismantlement created a ticking environmental time bomb. And the problem was not limited to Vladivostok. Across Russia, other reactor compartments were also left exposed in open-air storage areas, while some were even dumped into remote bays. Reports revealed that a few of those compartments contained damaged fuel, increasing the chances of radioactive leakage into surrounding waters. Vladivostok, however, stood out because of its visibility and because so many submarines were concentrated in one small area. Published investigations listed several reactor assemblies still present among the Pacific Fleet's mothball lines. Experts warned that keeping so many deteriorating hulks in shallow, open water increased the danger dramatically. Unlike secure storage facilities, these submarines sat vulnerable to storms, tides, and the slow but relentless effects of corrosion. A single hull breach could release dangerous radioactive particles directly into the ocean. Survey teams even discovered submarines that were missing from official records, completely unaccounted for until they were physically rediscovered. The idea that some nuclear reactors had simply been lost in paperwork horrified international observers. In nuclear safety, even one unmonitored reactor compartment is considered unacceptable. Environmental experts also raised concerns about the region's fishing industry. The waters around Vladivostok are heavily fished and used as shipping routes. The idea that active reactor compartments might still contain nuclear fuel so close to populated areas raised serious questions about contamination, not only of the marine ecosystem but also of the seafood eaten and exported by local communities. Traces of radioactive isotopes have already been detected in local sediments, though experts say more studies are needed to identify their exact sources. For decades, the world believed that Russia was safely dismantling its Cold War fleet under strict control. The reality turned out to be far more grim. Many submarines remain untouched, their steel hulls weakening year by year, and their reactors still loaded with potentially dangerous materials. The people of Vladivostok have become used to seeing the eerie shapes of old conning towers rising above the water, but now they know these are not just relics, they are reactors corroding in open air. As one expert said, "We used to think of them as just old ships. Now we have to think of them as reactors left in the open." When the first reports about this nuclear graveyard surfaced, they couldn't be ignored. Local authorities in Vladivostok were forced to act. Radiation monitoring teams arrived quickly, setting up checkpoints along the coast and near fishing villages. Early readings were not catastrophic but did show elevated levels of radiation in seawater and sediments. Officials publicly claimed there was no immediate danger, while quietly admitting behind closed doors that the situation required close monitoring. Environmental organizations soon stepped in to conduct independent surveys, and their findings supported what many feared: the risk was not hypothetical. Local fishermen were already being exposed to contaminated water, and some seafood samples showed traces of radiation. The revelations spread fast. International media and scientific publications began covering the story, pointing out that similar cleanup efforts in other parts of Russia had only succeeded because of foreign aid. Without such cooperation, removing the reactor compartments from Vladivostok could take decades. The warnings carried extra weight because people's livelihoods depended on the sea. Fishing is one of the main industries in the region, and even rumors of contamination threatened to damage the economy. Buyers in neighboring countries began questioning whether seafood from Vladivostok was safe, pressuring Russian authorities to provide clear answers. The government's reaction was mixed. Some officials in Moscow dismissed the reports as exaggerated, claiming that safety measures were sufficient. Others privately admitted that the problem was real and that failing to act would cost far more in the long run. Behind closed doors, ministries debated how much to reveal to the public. Some feared that acknowledging the full extent of the contamination might damage Russia's international standing and hurt its energy and trade negotiations. Locally, however, leaders demanded immediate federal help, stressing that the issue was about both public health and economic survival. International organizations requested full access to the raw radiation data, hoping to assess the situation independently. Russia released only partial reports, withholding details about the reactor's exact locations and conditions. This lack of transparency fueled more distrust. Environmental watchdogs argued that every delay increased the danger. Submarine hulls continued to corrode, and without consistent maintenance or funding, the situation could worsen rapidly. Cleanup operations require years of planning, specialized tools, and large sums of money. Yet even with this knowledge, funding commitments remained uncertain. The people living near the coast were left in limbo, aware of the risk but unsure whether help would ever come. As public concern grew, activists demanded that the government release full survey maps and open the area to international observers. State media carefully balanced its coverage, acknowledging the existence of the submarines but downplaying their risks. This half-truth approach only deepened public suspicion. Independent experts who spoke out confirmed the worst fears. Vladivostok was facing an environmental crisis that demanded immediate action. Whether the political system could respond fast enough was another question entirely. The deeper truth is that the story of Vladivostok's submarine graveyard doesn't end with its discovery. The problem stretches decades into the future. Beneath the surface lie not just steel wrecks but long-lasting radioactive materials that can continue leaking for generations. Technical reports confirm that similar submarine graveyards exist in other parts of Russia, including the Arctic. Some of these compartments still hold nuclear fuel, while others were never fully defueled. Many are deteriorating faster than expected. Experts explain that the danger is slow but continuous. It's not a sudden explosion but a gradual release of radioactive particles into the water, the soil, and marine organisms. Each passing year increases the complexity of cleanup and the cost of containment. Without proper action, the environmental impact could spread far beyond Russia's borders. The steps needed to address the issue are already clear. First, every remaining submarine and reactor compartment that still contains fuel must be safely defueled. This is a delicate and expensive process that can only be done in specialized facilities. Second, these reactor compartments must be moved to permanent, secure storage far from populated or coastal areas. Temporary fixes like open-air storage yards are no longer acceptable because they only delay the danger instead of eliminating it. Third, transparent and continuous monitoring is essential. The public must have access to accurate radiation data collected by independent experts, not just government agencies. Without transparency, mistrust grows, and small problems can become crises before anyone reacts. History has already shown that secrecy delays effective action and increases the damage. Finally, international cooperation is not just helpful, it's necessary. The world's oceans are connected, and contamination from one region can easily affect others. Foreign governments and organizations have the technology and expertise needed to assist, but cooperation requires honesty and commitment. Experts argue that addressing the problem in Vladivostok is not just about protecting Russia, it's about protecting everyone who depends on the Pacific Ocean. Watchdog organizations now call for a strict timeline. They propose removing all still-fueled compartments within the next decade, building permanent storage within 20 years, and maintaining public monitoring throughout the process. Any delay or compromise increases the risk of a regional disaster. Local communities are demanding answers, neighboring countries are pressing for accountability, and environmental groups are raising global awareness. The lesson from past nuclear accidents is simple: waiting too long makes everything worse. Once the submarine structures deteriorate beyond a certain point, even massive funding cannot undo the contamination. Acting now is cheaper, safer, and more responsible than waiting until an irreversible emergency occurs. The submarine graveyard of Vladivostok is more than just a Cold War relic, it's a living reminder of what happens when humanity pushes technology beyond its ability to manage it. Beneath the calm waters lies a problem that could shape the environmental future of an entire region. Whether the authorities act swiftly or continue to delay will determine not only the fate of the submarines but also the safety of countless people who depend on the sea.